12. A weapon that was simultaneously a brilliant feat of technology and a waste of resources. The German V-2 rocket, or Vengeance Weapon 2, was the world's first ballistic missile. It carried a ton of explosives to the edge of space, then descended at unstoppable supersonic speeds to detonate on its target. It was a brilliant, advanced, and revolutionary feat of technology. It was also one of history's most wastefully expensive weapons. From its first operational launch against enemy targets in September 1944, to Germany's surrender 9 months later, roughly 3,000 V-2s were fired. They did not all reach their targets, but even if they had, at 1 ton of explosives per warhead, that would have been 3,000 tons of explosives dropped on enemy cities over 9 months. During the same period, the RAF routinely dropped more than 3,000 tons of explosives on German cities in single nighttime bombing raids. American bombers also frequently exceeded that 3,000-ton total in single bombing raids during the daytime. The Allied explosive delivery tools were reusable and thus far more economical. Most of the Allied bombers returned to base, reloaded, and returned the next day or night to again drop more than 3,000 tons of explosives on German cities, and repeated the process dozens of times. Moreover, during its 9 months of firing, the 3,000 tons of explosives dropped by the V-2 killed 2,754 people. Most were not soldiers but civilians whose deaths, while tragic, did not impede the Allied war effort by much. By contrast, it is estimated that over 20,000 workers, mostly slave laborers toiling in horrific conditions, died while manufacturing the V-2. That gave the V-2 the tragic distinction of being perhaps the only weapon system in history whose production cost more lives than did its actual use. Thus, when contrasting the cost with the results, the V-2 literally produced little bang for the buck. 11. Hitler's super tank. The Panzer VIII Maus was the heaviest tank ever built. It measured about 33 feet long, 12 feet wide, 12 feet high, and weighed nearly 200 tons. Its secondary armament was a 75mm coaxial gun instead of a machine gun. Its main gun was a 128mm monster capable of destroying any Allied tank at ranges of up to 2.2 miles. It was increased at Hitler's insistence to 150mm, because the Führer thought the 128mm looked like a toy gun on the Maus. Unfortunately for the Germans, and fortunately for the Allies, the Maus' huge size and heavy weight came at a correspondingly heavy price that made it nearly useless. The tank was too heavy for most bridges. So in order to cross rivers it had to either wade through fords where available, or drive over the river's bottom while using a snorkel for ventilation. Additionally, to simply get the Maus moving was a problem. It was no easy task to develop an engine and drivetrain that were powerful enough to propel 200 tons of metal on the ground at any appreciable speed, yet small enough to fit inside the tank. In the end, the maximum speed achieved during trials was 8 miles per hour on a hard surface. 10. Too big to be useful. The Panzer VIII Maus was intended to spearhead German attacks. The idea was that it would smash through any opposition and destroy all enemy armor it came across, impervious to damage from any tanks whose path it crossed. It had 9.4 inches of turret armor, 8 inches of hull front armor, 7 inches of hull side armor, and 6 inches of rear armor. That made the Maus largely immune from Allied tanks, whose shells would simply bounce off the behemoth. However, it was built in 1944, by which time the Allies not only had aerial superiority on both the Western and Eastern Front, but well-nigh complete aerial supremacy over the battlefield. The Maus might have had sufficient armor against weapons fired from the ground. However, it did not have sufficient armor up top to render it immune from armor-piercing bombs or rockets dropped or fired from above. Ultimately, the Panzer VIII Maus was symptomatic of Hitler's irrational obsession with big things and superweapons. He was indifferent or unable to understand their relative cost-effectiveness compared to other, normal weapons that could accomplish the same task at a fraction of the cost. Reliance on such pedestrian weapons would have freed up scarce resources for other uses that could have better served the German war effort. 9. Hitler's supergun. In 1942, a German ballistics engineer named August Konders convinced Hitler that he had come up with a design for a supergun that just might knock Britain out of the war. Konders' gun had a 417-foot barrel, from which an elongated projectile that weighed hundreds of pounds would be fired. As it made its way through the barrel, the shell would be accelerated by the successive detonation of 32 more charges, and exit with a muzzle velocity of 4,920 feet per second. The supergun's shells would travel almost 100 miles. As Konders put it to the Führer, if they were placed near the English Channel, the superguns could hit London. 50 such guns that launched 3,000 rounds a day could devastate central London and destroy a 15 square miles area of the British capital. The results from a prototype that used a 20mm gun showed promise, so the go-ahead was given to scale up the research and development for the project to wreck London. In May 1943, Albert Speer, the Reich Minister for Armaments and War Production, gave his boss a bit of good news amidst the gloom caused by many of the Führer's failed endeavors. Hitler was informed that work had begun on the new superguns that could fire hundreds of rounds an hour and hurl their special projectiles over extremely long distances. An underground complex was dug in the Pas de Calais in northern France, across the narrowest stretch of the English Channel that separated Nazi-occupied Europe from England. De la Panne à Gargantuan. The V3 site lay 6 miles inland, estimated to be safe from seaborne commando raids and British Royal Navy guns, and 103 miles from central London. It would house the Vergeltungswaffe 3, German for Vengeance Weapon 3. The superguns, whose name was shortened to the V3 cannons, and also known as the London cannons, were to be aimed at the British capital, which Hitler hoped to destroy. The underground complex was to include over 165 kilometers of tunnel, dug by German workers and slave laborers. The network of tunnels was to be linked to 5 inclined shafts, in which 25 huge gun tubes were to be laid, all aimed at central London. A similar complex would be built nearby, and once both were completed, 50 superguns would wreak havoc upon the enemy capital. As designed, the V3 superguns were to fire 10 explosive projectiles that weighed 310 pounds each, with a 55-pound explosive charge. 2 batteries were planned, and if they went all out, they would be able to fire 600 rounds per hour, 24 hours a day, and rain devastation down upon and wreck London. As Winston Churchill later commented, if the Nazis had managed to pull it off, it would have been history's most destructive conventional attack ever launched against a city. The Allies were completely in the dark about the V3 program, and their intelligence utterly failed to detect the project. Allied reconnaissance flights spotted the activity around the Pas de Calais complex, but analysts assumed that the photos depicted a potential base for the launch of V1 or V2 rockets. 7. How London got lucky. Luckily for London, V1s and V2 rockets were worrisome in of themselves and worthy of attention. So although the Allies were ignorant about the supergun project, they went ahead and subjected the site to frequent bomb raids anyhow from late 1943 onwards. The Allied aerial raids in the Pas de Calais area disrupted the construction of the structures needed to house the supergun project, and the Germans were eventually forced to abandon parts of the planned complex. The rest of the site was seriously damaged in July 1944, in a raid that used heavy ground-penetrating bombs that burrowed deep beneath the surface before they detonated. The underground explosions wrecked and collapsed the tunnel system, and buried hundreds of workers and technicians. In the meantime, various development bugs had slowed the pace of the project. Even when all went well, the V3 shells failed to reach the intended muzzle velocity of over 4,900 feet per second, and barely exceeded 3,300 feet. Trials in May 1944 fired shells to a range of 55 miles, impressive, but not enough to reach London from France. A July test failed catastrophically when a shell was fired 58 miles, only for the gun barrel to burst in the process. Construction was finally halted for good as the Allies made their way up the coast from Normandy to the Pas de Calais, and the abandoned V3 compounds fell to Canadian troops in September of 1944. It was only then that the Allies discovered just how big a threat the complex had actually posed, and just how lucky London had been to dodge that menace. 6. WWI's Bengal famine. The British Empire had long justified itself with the claim that it governed for the benefit of its colonized subjects. Its conduct during the Bengal famine of 1943 gave the lie to such pretenses. In the years before the famine, many Bengalis had barely eked out a subsistence from their lands, supplemented by imported rice, mainly from Burma. When the Japanese conquered Burma in 1942, Bengal was cut off from those imports, and the precarious existence of millions of Bengalis was tipped over into famine. It was made worse by the British colonial authorities' decision in 1942 to adopt a preemptive scorched earth policy in parts of Bengal that they feared the Japanese would overrun after they conquered Burma. That entailed a denial of rice policy. It came down to the removal or destruction of rice and other foodstuffs in Bengali districts that had a surplus. With traditional rice imports from Burma cut off, and homegrown surpluses destroyed by the British, famine roared through Bengal. Relief efforts were hampered by Churchill's decision to divert food shipments intended for the starving Bengalis to already well-supplied British soldiers in the Mediterranean. The result was one of the darker moments in a war full of darkness. In order to add to the stockpiles of food in Britain, ships loaded with wheat sailed past Indian cities whose streets were littered with the corpses of those starved to death. 5. Winston Churchill's ugly side. Offers of Canadian and American food aid to the starving Indians were turned down by Churchill's government, even as it prohibited India from using its own sterling reserves or its own ships to import food. Indeed, India was made to export over 70,000 tons of rice in the first half of 1943, while millions of Indians starved to death. When the government in Delhi sent the Prime Minister a telegram informing him of the devastation and that millions of Indians were dying, Churchill replied churlishly, "Then why hasn't Gandhi died yet?" The Viceroy of India described Churchill's attitude towards India as negligent, hostile, and contemptuous. Churchill was unrepentant, however. In addition to being shockingly callous about the millions of deaths sure to result from his orders, Churchill seemed viciously gleeful about the predictable consequences when they actually occurred. As he put it, referring to the deaths of millions of Bengalis under his watch, "I hate Indians. They are a beastly people with a beastly religion. The famine was their own fault for breeding like rabbits." That was the essence of colonialism, an imbalance of power between colonists and colonized. It created dynamics whereby respected figures such as Winston Churchill, widely praised for their moral virtues, could engage in morally reprehensible conduct without any qualms. It allowed the government that ruled both Indians and Britons to callously tolerate famine in India, even as it remained sensitive to British views that bread rationing in wartime Britain was an intolerable imposition. 4. General George S. Patton's less iconic aspects. George S. Patton was America's most famous fighting general of World War II. He led the U.S. 7th Army in North Africa and Sicily, and commanded the Third Army as it stormed through France, across Germany, and into Czechoslovakia. A man of contradictions, Patton was a hard-charging, profane, and often obnoxious figure. He also had a softer side and liked to write poetry, although not very well. And then there was the crazy side in which this great general convinced himself that he was some kind of eternal soldier, who had been reincarnated numerous times over the millennia as a warrior. In short, Patton was a man of extremes. He also elicited extreme reactions. People loved or hated him. He gave the latter plenty to hate, as his wartime exploits were often marred by controversies caused by his propensity to abuse his authority and those under his command. One incident from 1943 in which he slapped 6 soldiers almost cost him his career. It paled in comparison to another incident in 1945 hurriedly swept under the rug, in which Patton got hundreds of his men killed, wounded, or captured because of nepotism. General Patton's best-known controversy occurred during the 1943 Sicilian campaign. On a hospital visit, he came across a PTSD-suffering soldier who was also burning up with malarial fever. Seeing no visible wounds on the GI, Patton flew into a rage, accused the unfortunate man of cowardice, slapped him around, and threatened to shoot him. The great general repeated the disgraceful performance a few days later in another hospital, and physically assaulted another PTSD-suffering soldier. When the scandal broke, it nearly got Patton cashiered from the U.S. Army. Fortunately, General Dwight D. Eisenhower protected Patton and gave him a chance to command another army in France. 3. Nepotism kills. Patton did not learn the lesson about abuse of power. In 1945 he had a worse but lesser-known scandal in which he got hundreds of GIs killed, wounded, or captured for personal reasons. It happened in March 1945, when Patton ordered Task Force Baum, comprised of 314 men, 16 tanks, and dozens of other vehicles, to penetrate 50 miles behind German lines. Their mission: to liberate Hammelburg POW camp, which housed Patton's son-in-law John K. Waters. Task Force Baum's raid ended catastrophically. All tanks and vehicles were lost, and of 314 participants, 32 were killed, and most of the rest were wounded or captured. Only 35 men made it back. The worst part of it was that the mission was totally unnecessary. Patton's beloved son-in-law, for whom the great general had gotten the beloved sons, brothers, and fathers of many Americans killed or injured, had never been in any danger. Hammelburg was liberated 2 weeks after the Task Force Baum fiasco. When Eisenhower found out, he was furious at Patton's misuse of military personnel and assets for personal reasons, and reprimanded him. In light of his valuable services, however, Eisenhower declined to punish Patton beyond the reprimand. Shortly thereafter, a reporter got wind of the scandal. When the story first broke in a major publication on April 12, 1945, it would have wrecked Patton under normal circumstances. However, President Roosevelt died that same day, and his demise eclipsed all other news. The scandal got little traction, and when Patton died a few months later, the affair was reduced to a mere historic footnote. 2. The romanticized resistance. WWII's resistance movements in Western Europe were heroic, and were deservedly romanticized. However, their extent and importance has often been exaggerated. A common myth has it that resistance in Western Europe was widespread, and that its efforts tipped the balance in the Allies' favor, spelling the difference between victory and defeat. It is true that Eastern European resistance movements such as the Soviet and Yugoslav partisans contributed materially to victory with intense sabotage and guerrilla activities. However, the greatest contribution of Western Europe's resistance lay in intelligence gathering. Their sabotage and guerrilla efforts were negligible. It took great courage, and the men and women of the Western European resistance risked their lives on a daily basis. However, their impact was more symbolic than substantive. The actual impact of the resistance in Western Europe is that it contributed more to the locals' pride and self-esteem after the war for having done something, than to the actual winning of the war. The disparity between the resistance movements in Eastern Europe and the Balkans versus those of Western Europe is due to the manner in which the German occupiers treated their conquered subjects in different parts of Europe. Jews accepted German occupation of Western Europe, while severe, never approached the levels of psychotic cruelty and mindless brutality meted out to the conquered in Eastern Europe and the Balkans. 1. Resistance in Western versus Eastern Europe. Western European civilian populations in the main did not exhibit a willingness to risk the horrific reprisals and atrocities the Germans were prepared to inflict upon restive subjects. It was not due to lack of courage but lack of incentive. Because they were not treated as atrociously as were e.g. Soviet or Yugoslav civilians, Western Europeans' backs were not as much against the wall to where they felt they had nothing to lose. An exception were Western Europe's communists, who made a drastic turn from acquiescence to German occupation during the period of Russo-German friendship to fierce resistance after Hitler attacked the USSR. As a result, non-communist Western Europeans under Nazi occupation never flocked to the resistance in the kinds of numbers that transformed it into a mass popular movement as happened in the Balkans and the USSR. During the war, the resistance in Western Europe was not as widespread or intense as is often depicted in film or fiction. Far more people were willing to accept German occupation and make the best of a bad situation, than were willing to resist and risk German vengeance. E.g., far greater numbers of Frenchmen collaborated with the German occupiers than joined the resistance, whose numbers only boomed following the successful D-Day landings, after which late arrivals swelled the resistance ranks.